Cool. There we are. So good to have you with us, you that are joining us online, maybe watching this later, all of you here. In fact, we'll have a little fun since we got a pretty full house here. If I don't make it go crazy, just wave and say hello. So kind of nice. I'll flip this for just a minute. So otherwise you're watching going, I'm on a roller coaster ride. So here we are. So let's turn, believe it or not, tonight we get very close to finishing the Old Testament. And so this is kind of a whirlwind tour here, but let's start on page 35 in your student book, and we'll join in the opening prayer. Lord, you teach us so much in your word. The more we understand your dealings with your Old Testament people, the more we understand how you deal with us today. Teach us that your concern is never your ego, but our happiness and our welfare in time and eternity. In a world where many want to write their own program for life, help us understand your program for us, the program you revealed in the servant life, death, and resurrection of your Son, our Savior and Lord, in whose name we pray. Amen. So just by way of sort of an odd introduction, like I mentioned, we're getting to the end of the Old Testament narrative in our very cursory sweep. In the Crossways course, which spends more time in depth, they will get to this chapter in about 27 more lessons. So that's, they are kind of parallel with you. When they get to their chapter 11, they will be in the book of Deuteronomy. So I will make those recordings available if anybody would like to look at them sometime and see to go a little more in depth. The other thing that's probably even more important to share is, and I'll sort of say it like this, that when even in a cursory overview of the Old Testament narrative, we have, even in these sessions, run across some unsavory and unpleasant and difficult and challenging narratives. And that's okay, because what you'll discover if you go back and do more digging is that there are still unsavory and difficult and challenging narratives. There isn't anything that makes, obliteration of a people group easy or pleasant. But hopefully we can understand those a little bit more, but also to hang tighter to the New Testament hopes. And as you'll see in these next couple of units, much of what we're reading sort of forms and shapes the environment in which the gospel is unfolded. And so it will hopefully help you in that manner as well. So let's start by reviewing the illustrations and material from our unit last week on the prophets. And again, the prophets sometimes are a counterbalance to some of the hard stuff that we're reading, because we're reading some of that other narrative and going, yeah, how could God allow this to happen? Well, when you put the lay of the prophets on top, you can see very clearly God did not want any of that to happen, but it was the people's rebellion and refusal that led to what we'll pick up with today. So somebody read 10a.
Although the prophets sometimes spoke about future events, their main task was to attack a spiritually indifferent Israel and Judah on the basis of the Sinai covenant. They declared that because the people were ignoring the covenant stipulations or commandments, the covenant curses would overtake them.
Very good. And I want you to add a word into that. So right between, in that first sentence, between the word the and prophets, make one of those little carrots, right? The little triangle without a bottom that points up. And I want you to write this word on top of that. And the word, it's got a hyphen in it, P-R-E, hyphen, exilic, E-X-I-L-I-C. E-X-I-L-I-C. So it should read, although the pre-exilic prophets, because remember, talked a little bit about how there's sort of three eras or three phases of the prophetic work that we find. And we were looking, and we'll review here, the pre-exilic prophets. Okay. So that's what this picture is, right? What do you see? Any prophet, it's not a certain particular prophet, but here's a prophet, probably not looking very unhappy. And for those of you southpaws, notice he's left-handed. So, right, holding up that left finger. And I grew up in a German household. That was a pretty common thing, but I suspect other nationalities would hold up a finger for scolding, but any of you who are German know exactly what I'm talking about. But he's after the people, right? What do you see behind the prophet is a broken covenant. And I wish in the illustration they would have been dots like we normally see, because sometimes you can say, well, that's a broken 10 commandments, which well, I suppose, but you can see 1, 2, 3, 4. The prophets are saying to the people, you've broken the covenant. And if you don't repent, if you don't return, if you don't change your ways, the curses of the covenant will come upon you. And in particular here, the curses are shown as here comes the Assyrians marching in attack. Here come the Babylonians marching in attack. Here come the Egyptians marching in attack. But behind the Assyrians, behind the Babylonians, behind the Egyptians, you see that symbol for God. God using these people to discipline, to punish the Israelites for their unfaithfulness. And that's the message that the prophet was saying. And the next picture talks about some of the individual sins that the prophets attacked. Somebody 10b.
Among the sins the prophets attacked were drunkenness, self-indulgence, indifference to the holy writings and the covenant, greed for money, dishonesty in business, and corruption in legal proceedings.
And thank God we're past those things in our modern society, right? I mean, that is the unnerving reality when you read the prophets and the pre-exilic prophets warning the people about the things they need to walk away from and turn from. And you think, oh my goodness, these could be a script for a Hollywood movie or something like that, right? But so it goes. And there are also national sins, if you will. Somebody take the next one.
On the national level, prophets attacked the nation for seeking security in fortresses, weapons, and treaties with other nations. They insisted that God would bring these practices to an end and reduce their defense systems for fortresses, large homes, and vineyards to rubble.
Yeah, we haven't grown past this one either, have we?
This stuff's getting scary.
It is, and rightly so. And finally, 10d.
Few took the message of the prophets seriously. The end result was that the Assyrians destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel in 721 BC and led thousands of its citizens into exile. The Babylonians put down revolts in Judah in 597 and 587 BC, in which year they also destroyed Jerusalem and its temple, and on both occasions took thousands of people from Judah into exile in Babylon. The exiles taken from Judah to Babylon asked many questions about the disaster that had overtaken the nation. They also gave thought to whether or not they would ever return to Judah, whether or not the Davidic dynasty would ever be restored, and what they must do to avoid another similar catastrophe.
And it's that little closing part that segues into what you got a chance, hopefully, to read through. Any questions, though, on the unit on the prophets? Not seeing any. Let's jump ahead. Again, looking at the narrative here, one of the things that's sort of interesting, this is again the Hebrew order of what you and I would refer to as our Old Testament. And notice that tonight we invited you especially to read Ezra and Nehemiah. That's the third and fourth book from the end of the Hebrew Bible. Our next unit after that, we'll look at 1st and 2nd Chronicles, which are the final books in the Old Testament and in the Hebrew Bible. And so we've kind of worked our way through this storyline where we took Genesis and saw some of the creation work there, and then picked up with the chosen people, the call of Abraham and Sarah, into Isaac and Rebekah, into Jacob and his wives and concubines, and kind of following them down into Egypt, eventually out of Egypt into the promised land. We looked a little bit at Joshua, a little bit at Judges. We did a quick overview of the kings. Then we backtracked and went over much of that same period of time with the prophets. And the people didn't listen. And so they went into exile. And as the title at the top of page 111 says, Judah, you are going home. That's what's happening in Ezra and Nehemiah. Now, interestingly enough, the northern kingdom, destroyed in 721 BC by the Assyrians, taken off into exile. And while some of them made some returns, because we'll read, for example, about, the story of the presentation of Jesus in the temple in Jerusalem, where Simeon comes up, and then Anna, and we're told that Anna is from the tribe of Asher. Asher was one of those northern tribes that was taken off into exile. So some of them kind of came back, but we don't hear, at least biblically in the narrative, any sort of mass return like we do for that southern tribe of Judah. Okay, so that's why it says, Judah, you are going home. So we'll pick up on that theme. But again, here's our timeline. If you want to look in your timeline itself or on the line or on the screen here, again, those dots, here's 1900 BC, 1800, 17, 16, etc. And then they reach down to the timeline. This is the main timeline that we're finding. Prior to 1900 BC, you see a clock at the top. We're going to have to explain, in 50 years, children won't know what that round thing is with those slashes on it, we'll have to explain it to them. But anyway, with this clock and a question mark, because that narrative in Genesis 1 through 11, surprise, surprise, Bible scholars debate these things, and it's difficult to come to agreement on time frame. But by the time Abraham shows up, most everybody's more or less in the same place within a few years, give or take. But so we've got the timeline working our way across, and then underneath the timeline are these frames, and you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 on the screen. What you won't see on the screen that you have on your physical timeline is underneath each of those frames is some explanatory notes about what's happening in those areas. And I'll point to frame number 4 as an example. And at frame number 4, maybe you remember this, maybe you don't, but that's that covenant God made with Abraham, the scroll, land, offspring, blessings to the nation. And then above that torch and that pot that's smoking, that's that flaming torch and smoking fire pot. But notice the little blue arrow that kind of comes out near the top left, and then it points all the way back to Abraham. So sometimes these pictures fit on the timeline right underneath what they're talking about, but not always. This one points back, right? Or here you see, kind of with frame 5 pointing back. We'll get this looking at each of these illustrations. This is about creation. It is about Adam and Eve. It is about Cain and Abel. It's about Noah's Ark. It's about the Tower of Babel. Here we have God's original plan, right? Here sin breaks into the world and breaks everything apart. That covers Genesis 1 through 11. Here's that picture we were talking about with the smoking fire pot and the flaming torch. And here's sort of where the patriarchs start and where they end up down in Egypt. And we've got this one little piece of green with a little cave on it. That's that burial cave that Abraham bought. So some of that stuff is there. Then here's the Exodus, right? This is a picture I want you to kind of get in your brain. So when you see that, we pick up on that a little bit. But when it comes back to the timeline, notice Exodus is picture number 6, and now it's on the right-hand side. It goes over this way. So just pay attention. If you ever wonder what those arrows are on the bottom, they're trying to catch you where they fit in the timeline, okay? And so here we have that long sojourn in Egypt. Here's a simple version of the Exodus, the pyramid broken. There we have the covenant at Sinai, and there you see the 5 dots and the law codes. And then we've got numbers here, and these are numbers representing the judges. And so if you're looking at your timeline up in the upper left section, you'll see a list of black numbers with names after those. Those are the judges so represented here. Then around 1,000 on either side, you'll see a green square with a black box with a white number 1 inside. If you look back on that list again, you'll see that that's the United Kings. That's Saul. Next to that comes David. So you've got a white number 2 in a black box, white number 3, Solomon, and then that big rip when the kingdom split. And now suddenly a new timeline shows up in the north, and it continues for just a little while. But looking at the pictures underneath, there's the conquest under Joshua. Here are the judges. Here's David expanding the realm. Here's Solomon building the temple. And then we pick up from here and we get to our northern kingdom, which comes to an end. There's your 721 BC, and it even mentions that right up here in the dot. Then you've got the southern kingdom continues. Here you see the name Judah. Up here you see the name Israel. And then notice all the scrolls, right? These are the scrolls of the prophets, and the prophets are black numbers inside white circles, and they are also up on that list that we had. And we will be looking, this is the Babylonian exile, hence that ziggurat, that sort of more flat stepped pyramid with chains on top to signify that they're there against their will. There's a period of time where they are staying there, but eventually they will go home. And so that's what we're picking up on today and in future lessons. So here's your prophets warning the people. Here's all the kings and the daggers, all the times that they were assassinated, always in the north, assassinated by another dynasty that took over. And the assassinations in the south were done by the people themselves. But as soon as they killed that person, they put a descendant of David on the throne. Here I just listed the prophets. So this is the names you'll see there as you work your way through. We're going to be picking up on this picture tonight. Here they're going into exile, but you also see this arrow coming back and with the big Star of David, because that's where we'll be focusing. And so let's turn to the illustrations that we have for chapter 11, and we look at 11a. And hopefully at the top you see creation 1, Exodus 1, and at the bottom you see Exodus 2, creation 2. Let's take a little look. Top part shouldn't be too much of a challenge. We spent time, few units back, looking at creation. And so it's simply representing that so we followed that biblical timeline. It begins with the story of creation. And then eventually, of course, through Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, they end up in Egypt. They're eventually enslaved. And then under the leadership of Moses and Aaron and Miriam, they are released and carried through the wilderness, brought down to Sinai, made the covenant with them, carried through wilderness into the promised land under Joshua. That's the Exodus. It's called Exodus 1 and Creation 1 because these languages will be picked up in what we read here. But it goes the other direction. It starts with Exodus 2 and moves to Creation 2. So look on page 111. and looking especially at this section from Isaiah that I didn't officially ask you to read, but if you got a chance to do it with some of the questions, here's one of the things Bible scholars debate. Nobody debates that Isaiah chapter 1 through 39 seems to be a coherent unit at a time when Isaiah, the prophet, was doing his work. Everybody agrees that what begins in chapter 40 and continues through the rest of the book is different. What they don't agree on is whether both sections were written by Isaiah, the prophet in Jerusalem, or whether Isaiah the prophet wrote 1 through 39. And then what happens is the prophets sometimes, the language the scholars use is they have a school. Some, people would surround the prophet to learn from them. And so hard to tell if Isaiah himself predicted these things hundreds of years in advance, or if someone in the school of Elijah were writing these things, but doesn't really matter, because what's important are the words that we read. And so open up to Isaiah chapter 40. And I might even take you back one single chapter to chapter 39. This is during the reign of Hezekiah, one of the kings. And if you want to look in your timeline, you can kind of get a picture of when Hezekiah was king. Let's do that for fun. Hezekiah is king number 16, white numbers in a black box. See it between 17 and 1800 BC? You look up there and you see Jotham, Ahaz, Hezekiah. See where it is on your timeline? His name here. So go see 1700, 1800, kind of right in between, go straight up and you see starts 6 at the top and goes down to 16. Hezekiah is king number 16. Now go to the timeline itself and you find king number 16, and it's basically right underneath 700. Got it? So Hezekiah is on the throne when the Assyrians come to attack the north and drag them off into exile. And it's around that time, verse 39 tells us, and you don't have to worry about the crazy name, Merodach Baladan, but anyway, a king named MB, that's easier, right? MB, son of B, from B, he sends envoys to Hezekiah, and he sends a present. He sends letters because he heard that he'd been sick and that he had gotten better. And verse 2 tells us he welcomed them and he showed them his treasure. He took them on a tour and showed them all sorts of stuff. And there, end of verse 2 says there was nothing in his house or in all the realm that he did not show them. I mean, have you ever had visitors come to your house and you show them around the house? It's kind of an ancient human practice, right? Your house is like mine. There might be a door or two you don't open. Or I can always tell when we have company. I always joke with my wife. She does. I think it's funny she doesn't. So I'm getting recorded. So I'm probably in trouble for sure now. But I always know we're really getting company when I walk into my bathroom and the towels I use aren't there. And there's other towels that nobody uses that only come out when company is coming over or whatever. But anyway, I mean, it's pretty normal, right? But then verse 3, somebody read.
The prophet Isaiah came to King Ezekiel and said to him, "What did these men say? From where did they come to you?" Ezekiel answered, they have come to me from a far country, from Babylon. He said, what have they seen in your house? Ezekiel answered, they have seen all that is in my house. There's nothing in my storehouses that I did not show them. Then Isaiah said to Ezekiel, hear the word of the Lord of hosts. Days are coming when all that is in your house and that which your ancestors have stored up until this day shall be carried to Babylon. Nothing shall be left, says the Lord. Some of your own sons who are born to you shall be taken away. They shall be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. Then Ezekiel said to Isaiah, the word of the Lord that you have spoken is good, for he thought there will be peace and security in my days.
Now, these words might sound familiar because they're repeated almost verbatim in 2 Kings. So this little chapter in Isaiah is also in 2 Kings, right? So what's he do? He shows these foreigners all the stuff in his house, and the prophet comes and says, where'd they come from? What'd you show them? Well, I showed them everything. And he says, this is what God says. Everything you showed them will one day end up in Babylon. And he says, that's what's going to happen in the future. And Hezekiah goes, well, that's not bad. That means I'm good. Short-sightedness, right? Sometimes there. But then suddenly, the very next chapter, somebody read, and if you know Handel's Messiah, you'll probably get music going through your head. So prepare yourself. But somebody read verses 1 and 2.
Comfort, comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem. Tell her that her sad days are gone and that her sins are pardoned. Yes, the Lord has punished her in full for all her sins.
Quite different in tone. And if you let your eyes read verses 3 and 4, you might say, I've heard that someplace. And you know where you've heard it, right? In church. Ah, good answer. Yes, that's where. Nope, it's not in Genesis. You want to visit Mark chapter 1? And look at verse 3. Or for that matter, verse 2. Mark chapter 1. There it is. So we'll come back. We'll spend more time there much later, but not really, only a couple of chapters. But all of a sudden, there's this language of change. And he tries on page 111 to summarize several of the themes that are happening in Isaiah 40 through 66, really mostly here 40 through 55. And here are some of the points. Judah, you're going home. What do you mean we're going home? We're in Babylon. We've been in Babylon for years. How many of you know this verse? I'll read it first. Should have had a bookmark here, but that's all right. I'll get there eventually. For surely I know the plans I have for you, says the Lord. Plans for your welfare and not for harm, to give you a future with hope. I hear somebody saying it. What is it? Jeremiah 29:11. Jeremiah was the last of the pre-exilic prophets. He was Judah's last chance. And they didn't listen. And Jeremiah then was not only the last warner, but he was also there when Jerusalem got overrun and sacked. And he saw the city destroyed. He saw the temple burned. And the book of Lamentations is attributed to him weeping and lamenting the destruction of Jerusalem. Jeremiah, because the king, and this is all, as I always think, it's kind of fun, because we see these Bible names, you go, oh, I can never pronounce that, but we can all do Nebuchadnezzar, because we've heard Nebuchadnezzar, even though it's, a 37, not really, but it's this big long name, but everybody knows Nebuchadnezzar, so that one doesn't trouble us too much. But Nebuchadnezzar knew that Jeremiah was telling them, God is sending the Babylonians here. To fight against them is to fight against God. Surrender and it will go well for you. Fight and it will go poorly. And of course, they don't want to surrender. They fight. It goes ugly. And but Nebuchadnezzar knows this. So when he sacks the city, he says to Jeremiah, what do you want to do? You want to come back with us? You want to stay here? And he says, I'll stay here. So he stays and he writes a letter to the exiles in Babylon. Chapter 29 is that letter in Jeremiah. That passage, I know the plans I have for you, says the Lord. Plans for your welfare, not for your harm, to give you a future with hope. That's a letter written to the Babylonians, or to the people of Judah who are in Babylon when they're in exile. Here's something else he writes. Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, to all the exiles whom I have sent into the exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and live in them. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Take wives and have sons and daughters. Take wives for your sons. Give your daughters in marriage, that they may bear sons and daughters. Multiply there. Do not decrease. And maybe you've heard this passage. But seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf. For in its welfare, you will find your welfare. And literally, the word that is translated welfare is shalom. Pray for the shalom of the city where I have sent you. In its shalom, you will find shalom. In fact, I like to think that verse is sort of like the life verse for the Jewish people down through the centuries. Because wherever they have gone, both willingly and not, they have sought to become a part of the fabric and the structure of the communities in which they live. And they seek to prosper wherever they are planted and to bring prosperity there. But so now, yes, it was hard getting there, but now they've been there for a couple of generations. Many of them are doing quite well. And the word is in Isaiah, you're going home. You're going back. And so here's this anticipated question. Well, can God do this? And look at the answer. Let's open to Isaiah 43. And we're going to spend most of the rest of our time here in Isaiah for just a minute. Isaiah chapter 43, verse 14 through 20. Somebody wants to read 21. Somebody wants to read that.
Thus says the Lord, your Redeemer, the Holy One of Israel. For your sake I will send to Babylon and break down all the bars, and the shouting of the Chaldeans will be turned to lamentation. I am the Lord, your Holy One, the Creator of Israel, your King. Thus says the Lord, who makes a way in the sea, a path in the mighty waters, who brings out chariot and horse, army and warrior. They lie down, they cannot rise, they are extinguished, quenched like a wick. Do not remember the former things, or consider the things of old. I am about to do a new thing, now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it? I will make a way in the wilderness and rivers in the desert. Wild animals will honor me, the jackals and the ostriches, for I give water in the wilderness, rivers in the desert, to give drink to my chosen people, the people whom I formed for myself, so that they might declare my praise.
Does that sound at all familiar? Look at verse 16, who makes a way in the sea, who brings out chariot and horse. They lie down, they cannot rise, right? I mean, that's grabbing a hold of the Exodus language from Egypt and applying it to being set free from Babylon. It's like another Exodus. Can God do this? Yeah, as I open the waters to rescue you from Egypt, I'll open the waters and rescue you from Babylon. So do you see the chains around Babylon and the splash of water here? Anybody know how far it is from Babylon to Jerusalem? Straight shot, 600 miles. Straight shot, right through the desert. You want to follow the Fertile Crescent down? It's 900 to 1,000 miles. On foot, or perhaps in a wagon. Long time, right? So the question might be, oh, that's a long way. It's really far. Let's go back to Isaiah chapter 40. And somebody read verses 3, 4, and 5.
Calling in the wilderness, prepare the way for the Lord. Make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Every valley will be raised up, every mountain and hill made low. The rough ground shall become level, and rugged places a plain. And the glory of the Lord will be revealed, and all the people will see it together, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken.
So what's the terrain going to be like? What's God going to do to the terrain? Smooth it out. It's going to be a smooth road. The Lord will lead you. And in fact, the glory of the Lord will be revealed. Well, that may be fine, God, for you to say that. What are the Babylonian gods going to say about this? Because, of course, when they get into Babylon, all of this is written in their temples. The Babylonian gods conquered the Hebrew God. So their definition was, the Bible, of course, says that God brought the Babylonians there. Well, let's look at verses 18 through 20 in this same chapter. Somebody got 18, 19, 20?
He'll substitute.
You're substituting for you. Go ahead, David. I know you can do it.
Who can you compare God? What image can you find to resemble him? Can he be compared to an idol formed in the mold, overlaid with gold and decorated with silver chains? Or if people are too poor for that, they might at least choose wood that won't decay and a skilled craftsman to carve an image that won't fall down.
So what are the Babylonian gods? They're just carvings. They're nothings. And in other places, it'll talk about how they got to get put on the back of an animal to get anywhere. They're false gods. They're nothings. Okay. Well, how are we going to get there? Are we going to be safe? Look at chapter 40, verses 9 to 11. And you'll probably have the Messiah music going through your head here too. Somebody read 9, 10, and 11.
Good tidings to Zion. Go up on a high mountain. You who bring good tidings to Jerusalem. Lift up your voice with a shout. Lift it up. Do not fear. Say to the towns of Judah, here is your God. See, the sovereign Lord comes with power, and his arm rules for him. See, his reward is with him, and his recompense accompanies him. He tends his flock like a shepherd. He gathers the lamb in his arms. He carries them close to his heart. He gently leads those who have young.
Right? It's going to carry you. The Lord is your shepherd, right? These kinds of languages. Yeah, but we're going through a wilderness. Is there going to be water? They have a few water problems when they went through the first wilderness waterings. You remember that? Look at Isaiah 41, verses 17 through 20.
are parched with thirst. But I, the Lord, will answer them. I, the God of Israel, will not forsake them. I will make rivers flow on barren heights and springs within the valleys. I will turn the desert into pools of water and the parched ground into springs. I will put in the desert the cedar and the acacia, the myrtle and the olive. I will put pines in the wasteland and fir and the cypress together, so that people may see and know, may consider and understand that the hand of the Lord has done this, that the Holy One of Israel has created it.
It's not going to be a problem for God to do that. And there was the sixth one that talks about how the land was wrecked, right? The Babylonians, anybody who was there and saw what happened. By the way, look at Psalm 137. We don't want to miss out on the anguish and the agony. Psalm 137. 137. I don't want you to get the impression that all was nothing but giggles and laughs in Babylon. Terry, you probably have the right voice to read this psalm. Yeah, I know. It's getting those thin pages split apart.
Right. Lament over the destruction of Jerusalem. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and there we wept, when we remembered Zion. On the willows, there we hung up our harps. For there our captors asked us for songs, and our tormentors asked for mirth, saying, sing us one of the songs of Zion. How could we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. Let my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth, if I do not remember you, if I do not set Jerusalem above my last struck. Remember, O Lord, against the Edomites, the day of Jerusalem's fall, how they said, tear it down, down to its foundations. O daughter Babylon, you devastate. Happy shall they be who pay you back what you have done to us. Happy shall they be who take your little ones and dash them against the rock.
It ends kind of ugly, doesn't it? But it gives you a sense of the depth of despair and sadness and brokenness and loss that the people felt as they saw Jerusalem being destroyed and as they were carried off into exile. And so again, there's that longing for what happened there, but also this recognition that when we go back, we're going back to nothing, right? So let's look at Isaiah 51, verses 1 through 3. Got that, Paul?
The Lord says, listen to me, you that want to be saved, you that come to me for help. Think of the rock from which you came, the quarry from which you were cut. Think of your ancestor Abraham and of Sarah, from whom you are descended. When I called Abraham, he was childless, but I blessed him and gave him children. I made his descendants numerous. I will show compassion to Jerusalem for all who live in her ruins. Though her land is a desert, I will make it a garden, like the garden I planted in Eden. Joy and gladness will be there, and songs of praise and thanks to me.
So even if it's desolate, right? God's referring back, right? Back to Eden. That takes us back to creation, back to Abraham and Sarah. That takes us back to the original calling of the chosen people. God says, I can do this. And then the question is, well, what's our lives going to be like? Look at a couple of these verses. We're in near Isaiah 51. Look at verse 11. Somebody read Isaiah 51:11.
So the ransom of the Lord shall return and come to Zion with singing. Everlasting joy shall be upon their heads. They shall obtain joy and gladness, and sorrow and sighing shall flee away.
Okay, skip ahead to chapter 52, verse 9. Okay, and go all the way back to chapter 40, kind of where we started. And 9 to 11, we read earlier about how, here's your God, he comes with you, he'll feed his flock like a shepherd, carry the lambs in his arms. So what's going on? This is what this picture is trying to capture from just some of these select verses, that the people are going to go back. It's going to be like the Exodus all over, except this time it'll be from Babylon going back home. They will be and see the people with their hands raised in praise. It's like you're going to have one long worship procession from Babylon back to the land. Here's the pillar of fire and the pillar of cloud. God is going to be present to lead you. Here is this river and trees. There's going to be shade. There's going to be water as you go along the way. And when you come back, God will be able to remake the land just as he originally created. And so you have this kind of creation 1, Exodus 1, and now in this language of returning back from Babylon, the Exodus language gets grabbed a hold again, and the hopes of the beauty and the provision of creation are lifted up. When the people get back, what they find is a mess. And we'll be seeing them kind of put that back together to some degree. They'll rebuild the temple, even though it won't have the glory of the previous temple. But what's also fascinating is that the Gospels lift up many of these same passages to talk about God's fulfillment of these age-old promises in Jesus. So we'll look at those more in detail when we come. How are the people changed? That's what this next picture is attempting to point out. The title at the top of page 113, Once to Babylon is Enough. I'll tell you a story that has parallels, but it's also a sad story. And I have no idea because I've lost touch with the person, but I had a roommate in college who, when he was a little boy, liked to take crackers and peanut butter and sneak them into his bed to eat at night. And his father, who was very stern, told him, do not take crackers and peanut butter into your room. And he persisted in doing so, and he thought he was nickel slick and could hide them in places his dad wouldn't see. And after a series of warnings, his father sadly beat the living tar out of him for disobeying. I tell you that story, not because I approve of what his father did, but because of the result that he shared with me. After that event, he never ate peanut butter again. And I've thought of that story because the biggest problem for the northern and southern kingdom was worshiping other gods. And they did it repeatedly. And that's why, and we didn't get into a lot of this detail, but if you read those prophets carefully, and especially in some of the older translations, they will talk to the people and warn them that they should stop a-whoring after other gods. Because remember, those other gods are fertility gods and goddesses. When they come back from Babylon, idolatry of that kind is gone. and they will never wrestle with that again. Okay? So as they come back from Babylon, a number of things get raised. At the top of the picture on page 112 is a picture of a crown with a question mark on it. Because when the Babylonians came the first time in 597 BC, they captured King Jehoiachin and took him off into exile, and took one of his uncles and put him on the throne in his place as a vassal king. That king was Zedekiah. Right? Yes, Zedekiah. Zedekiah went along for a while, but eventually got convinced by his cronies that they had the muster to rebel against the Babylons and to quit paying their servitude fees. Nebuchadnezzar came back the second time and captured Zedekiah. And in brutality, if you read it, the royal family, when they saw that the walls were breached, went out a back door and started heading out to the wilderness in Jericho, but they got caught and they were dragged back to where the king of Babylon was. And what the king of Babylon did was made the king watch everyone in his family get killed. And then he gouged out the king's eyes and dragged him off to Babylon. Both of those kings died in Babylon. When they came back, they didn't have a king. But they remembered the promises about how there would always be a descendant of David on the throne. And so one of the questions that gets raised is the Davidic dynasty over? Is it going to continue? Will God ever restore it? The temple was destroyed. They rebuilt a temple. And Ezra and Nehemiah, if you read, that when the elders who had lived through the original exile and saw remembered the original temple, likely as children, saw the new one, they wept. But when the people who hadn't seen it saw that the temple was finally put up, they rejoiced, and were told you couldn't tell the difference between the happy tears and the sad tears, right? But what the people do when they come back is they become a people formed around the temple. The temple becomes their center point. And doing the things that you need to do in and around the temple become significant. And so somebody read point 2 on page 113.
Although the people no longer had an earthly king, they did have a king, God. God's special house was the Jerusalem temple, and the priests made God's mercy and will known to the people. The community of Israel must honor and worship God in a fitting manner and offer sacrifice in only one place, the Jerusalem temple. The one place referred to in Deuteronomy, all those places,
Yes.
was eventually interpreted to mean Jerusalem, 2 Kings, and so on. There was to be no more idolatry, no more worship of false gods.
And so life around the temple and the whole priests and Levites became the central focus of the life of the people of Judah. And in fact, it's in the Babylonian exile, if you ever read or have read the book of Esther, that the Hebrew people, the people from Judah, are referred to as Jews. And when they return back to Judah, to Jerusalem, they are referred to as Jews. And so that's where that really, up until that point, you can call them Hebrew, Israelites, Judahites, whatever, but the term Jew shows up at this point, and it's life in and around the temple. It's also this. While in Babylon, the people came to understand that the prophets were right. and that they and their ancestors were wrong. And so whatever collecting of the scrolls of the prophets and the scrolls of the covenant and the scrolls of the law had been happening up till that point, clearly in exile, this began to occur more and more. But something else also began to occur. In searching those scrolls, they discerned 613 commandments, statutes, and ordinances. And maybe you know 248 say thou shalt, and 365 are thou shalt nots. And you see these little law codes around the big law code. Something else began to grow up. And again, scholars debate about exactly when all of this happened. Some of this certainly could have happened prior to the exile in Babylon, but the exile in Babylon accelerated what's known, these little miniature tablets are known as the oral traditions. And in classic Judaism, God had Moses write the Torah, which includes, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, the law with the 613 laws. And then God whispered to Moses all of these oral traditions, which Moses in turn whispered to Joshua, which Joshua in turn whispered, which is kind of passed along and weren't put into writing until later. But the oral traditions circle the law, and their goal is to help you keep the law. For example, when does the Sabbath begin? Sundown on Friday. So the Sabbath begins sundown on Friday. The oral tradition says, as the sun begins to set, put your work things away and begin keeping Sabbath early. So when the clock strikes sundown, you're full bore keeping the Sabbath. Anybody ever traveled to Israel? I have not, so I'm only going on what people have told me. In Jewish-owned hotels in Israel, they have Sabbath elevators. Sabbath elevators open on every floor so that you don't have to do the work of pushing the button to tell which floor you're going on. These oral traditions will show up when we get into the New Testament. And you'll have some of this rather contrasting language where Jesus says, you've heard that it was said, but I say to you, and they hear that and they go, that's not the way the scribes and the Pharisees taught. And so much of the Jewish teaching post-exilic becomes looking at the law. The oral interpretation also help you to keep the law and reinterpret an old law for a new period of time. And again, still today, Jewish people will quote Rabbi Akiba or Rabbi Hillel or Rabbi whomever, and they'll say, so as they look at the passage, this is what this rabbi taught, this is what this rabbi taught, this is what this rabbi taught. That's still very much a practice within the Jewish faith today. So the oral traditions are there with the goal of helping you keep the law, right? So backing up a picture, we didn't listen to the prophets, so we better study hard what they've done. And in fact, we better start putting up some guardrails so that we can make sure that what happened before doesn't happen again. Speaking of which, here's the covenant. And blown up big are those stipulations. Arrow pointing back, because we know now that because we didn't keep the law, we didn't keep the covenant, the curses of the covenant came upon us. What happens if we really keep the law? And so some different schools would rise up, so much so that there were some, for example, in Jesus' time, who would say if all Israel could keep 2 consecutive Sabbaths, Messiah would appear. And we'll read in the Gospel of Mark how Jesus broke 2 consecutive Sabbaths, and the leaders are ready to get rid of him. And that's before you get to verse 7 in chapter 3 of the Gospel of Mark. So this idea, not everybody taught that, but look, somebody read point 5 on page 113.
Time went by, the teachers emphasized obedience so much that it overshadowed their understanding of covenant and grace. Many people thought that through obedience, they could manipulate God. Many saw the law codes as a merit system. If they were obedient, they would never again suffer calamities such as the Babylonian exile. Furthermore, as time went by, some of the teachers within Judaism taught their students that obedience to the law codes would hasten the coming of the Messiah.
Okay, so did you just get it? Again, we're kind of getting a snapshot here. Now, there are some other things. Look at this. Do you recognize this? What's inside the white circle? Right? There's our little pea and our kidney bean and the squiggly line and a part of that swoosh, right? So this is the promised land, right? This is the Holy Land. This is Israel. This is Palestine. This is Judah, you know, whatever you want to describe it. And you kind of see the circles emanating out from that. There were some who said that we had been formed, right? Abraham was called. We were chosen. The chosen people were blessed to be a blessing. And so there were some who spoke about how this needs to radiate out and that salvation will come from Israel. We're to make God known to the surrounding nations. In the other corner, we're called to be servants, called to be a light, and the lamp also represents wisdom. And so it wasn't all that, but let's take a look. There are 4 what are called servant songs in Isaiah. Turn to Isaiah chapter 42. And somebody read verses 1 through 4.
Here is my servant, whom I uphold, my chosen, in whom my soul delights. I have put my spirit upon him. He will bring forth justice to the nations. He will not cry or lift up his voice, or make it heard in the street. A bruised reed he will not break, and a dimly burning wick he will not quench. He will faithfully bring forth justice. He will not grow faint or be crushed until he has established justice in the earth, and the coastlands wait for his teaching.
Okay, so hear that, how there's this good thing, this servant, it's going to go out to the nations, right? And Gentiles and nations are 2 ways of translating the same word. Gentiles means the other nations. There's Israel, and then there's the Gentiles. There's the other nations. Look at chapter 49 in Isaiah. Turn my pages myself here. Somebody read verses 1 through 6.
Listen to me, distant nations, you people who live far away. Before I was born, the Lord chose me and appointed me to be his servant. He made my words as sharp as a sword. With his own hand, he protected me. He made me like an arrow, sharp and ready for use. He said to me, Israel, You are my servants. Because of you, people will praise me. I said, I have worked, but how hopeless it is. I have used up my strength, but have accomplished nothing. Yet I can trust the Lord to defend my cause. He will reward me for what I do. Before I was born, the Lord appointed me. He made me his servant to bring back his people, to bring back the scattered people of Israel. The Lord gives me honor. He is the source of my strength. The Lord said to me, I have a greater task for you, my servant. Not only will you restore to greatness the people of Israel who have survived, but I will also make you a light to the nations, so that all the world may be saved.
Hear it? So you have some of these sort of countering thought patterns emerging, some which are very temple focused, law focused, but also there are these voices that cry out, just like we saw originally, that it's meant to be salvation to the ends of the earth. Go to chapter 50. And start somebody in verse 4.
The sovereign Lord has given me an instructed tongue to know the word that sustains the weary. He wakens me morning by morning, wakens my ear to listen like one being taught. The sovereign Lord has opened my ears, and I have not been rebellious. I have not drawn back. I offered my back to those who beat me, my cheeks to those who pulled out my beard. I did not hide my face from mocking and spitting. Because the sovereign Lord helps me, I will not be disgraced. Therefore have I set my face like flint, and I know I will not be put to shame. He who vindicates me is near. Who then will bring charges against me? Let us face each other. Who is my accuser? Let him confront me. It is the sovereign Lord who helps me. Who is he that will condemn me? They will all wear out like a garment. The moss will eat them up.
Okay. Sound a little familiar? Verse 6. Want to imagine how the people who encountered a Jewish rabbi from Nazareth began to hear those words, perhaps in a little different way? And now turn to chapter 52. And I'll read beginning in verse 13. See, my servant shall prosper. He shall be exalted and lifted up, and shall be very high, just as there were many who were astonished at him. So marred was his appearance beyond human semblance, and his form beyond that of mortals. So he shall startle many nations. Kings shall shut their mouths because of him. For that which has not been told them they shall see, and that which they had not heard they shall contemplate. Who has believed what we have heard, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he grew up before him like a young plant, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by others, a man of suffering and acquainted with infirmity. And as one from whom others hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him of no account. Surely he has borne our infirmities and carried our diseases, yet we accounted him stricken, struck down by God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the punishment that made us whole, and by his bruises we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. By a perversion of justice he was taken away. Who could have imagined his future? For he was cut off from the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of thy people. They made his grave with the wicked and his tomb with the rich, although he had done no violence, and there was no deceit in his mouth. Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him with pain. When you make his life an offering for sin, he shall see his offspring and shall prolong his days. Through him the will of the Lord shall prosper. Out of his anguish he shall see light. He shall find satisfaction through his knowledge. The righteous one, my servant, shall make many righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities. Therefore I will allot him a portion with the great, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out himself to death and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sin of many and made intercession for the transgressors. Now, through the centuries, Christians have been able to not hear those words without thinking about Jesus. But this is what is coming. So this whole sense of servant is there, but at the heart of this picture is the people gathered around the temple. And they focus their lives there in that place. And so Judaism is beginning to be born in the way that it takes shape. Now, there's still sacrifices at the temple, and those sacrifices will still be in place 5 centuries later when Jesus is walking the earth. And so it will take time for this all to unfold, but eventually in AD 70, we'll learn the temple is destroyed. And it's at that point that the whole sacrificial life of the people comes to an end. So this is a picture that tries to grab some of this. Back to these pictures here. It doesn't reference this in number 3, but you might find this interesting. That down through the ages, they started to describe the scrolls, they started to describe this part, and they used words like this. This is the bread of life. This is the water of life. This is the light of the world. And of course, we hear those words, and we'll hear Jesus say, I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the water of life. And you can begin to understand perhaps a little deeply why, when Jesus said those sorts of things, that the Jewish religious leaders said, this guy's got to go. This is blasphemy, right? Well, we have one more picture that tries to carry up on some of these themes as well. This is sort of a merger of a number of pictures. We'll take the top part first. Here's the Jerusalem with the Star of David. Inside here, you see a little dot with Samaria. That became the capital of the northern kingdom eventually under this wonderful King Ahab. But anyway, in 721 BC, the northern kingdom was dragged off into exile. And we mentioned how when they were taken away, the Assyrians brought some others from other places and put them there. You are aware that, humanly speaking, one of the most cruel ways that you can try and take the fight out of someone is to forcefully relocate them elsewhere. And if you know anything about what happened in our nation's history with Native American tribes, Trail of Tears, or what, we can think about obviously what the Nazis did with the Jews and others in World War II, taking them to concentration camps. But you are aware of what happened with the Japanese, for example, in my home state. Taking people out, one of the ways you take a fight out of someone is you forcefully relocate them. You may still fight. You'll fight for your home. And people will fight for their homes. But anyway, so they were dragged off into exile, and the people that were brought back intermingled with some of the folks who hadn't been carried off, and that mixed group of people became known as Samaritans. And you can see Samaria kind of comes from that. Well, there's more here. 597 is when the Babylonians made the first exile, and they took one king who didn't come back. That was Jehoiachin. Then 10 years later, in 587, they took Zedekiah off into Babylon, and that's when they burned and destroyed the temple. So that's where it shows up here. In 582, they rebelled again, but this time most of the people went scurrying off to Egypt. And that's, by the way, if you read Jeremiah, that's where Jeremiah was taken forcibly. He didn't want to go. He warned the people, stay here. I know it looks scary. It's going to be okay. Stay here. If you go down into Egypt, it's not going to be a good thing. And they didn't listen and went down into Egypt. What is interesting, though, and there's still archaeologically some of these things there. When they went down into Egypt, they built some of the structures that had been in Jerusalem. And so some of those are still, I'm told, down in Egypt. Then in 538, they came back. But they didn't come back with a king. So that's kind of the history of this. Let's take a look at how do you draw people who are ripped up by grief. That's what this is supposed to represent. So you see people who are grieving this destruction in Jerusalem. And all those wonderful houses that they thought they'd have with all the beautiful vines and fig trees and all of that, they come back to nothing but rubble. But there are some other voices, right? Again, what's going to happen to the king? Will we have a king? But there were also words of promises of how the wealth of the nations would come, how it would come by sea or by land. And of course, think for a moment about a celebration that officially we commemorate on January 6th, but people usually note it earlier about these foreigners who came on camels, so we think, to visit a newborn king. And they brought with them gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh, right? And so this picture is trying to capture that, some of that pathos. And here's a question that I don't think your book asks you. What do you do when you were certain of some of your hopes and those hopes don't come to be? What are your options? What do you do with a hope that doesn't get fulfilled in the time and place in which you thought it was going to be fulfilled? Well, you probably have some options, right? One option is give up on the hope. Another option is it wasn't a hope to begin with, right? You give up believing and you let that dashed hope. Another hope is you go back, or another thing is you might go back and look at that hope. Did I understand it right the first time? Did I somehow misread it? Or maybe you make your own hope, or you try to bring the hope into reality for itself, or maybe you take that hope and you push it off into the future. You still hang on to it, but now you're just not sure when. The bottom paragraph on page 115. When Jesus preached his first sermon, according to Luke, in his hometown of Nazareth, he referenced Isaiah. The quote unquote trouble is he only referenced part of it. Let's take a look at Isaiah 60. I think we have time for this. So somebody take verses 1 through 7 of chapter 60.
Rise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord has risen upon you. For darkness shall cover the earth, and thick darkness the peoples, but the Lord will arise upon you, and his glory will appear over you. Nations shall come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your dawn. Lift up your eyes and look around. They all gather together, they come to you. Your sons shall come from far away, and your daughters shall be buried in their nurses' arms. Then you shall see and be radiant, and your heart shall thrill and rejoice. Because the abundance of the sea shall be brought to you, the wealth of the nations shall come to you. A multitude of camels shall cover you, and the young camels of Midian and Ephah, all those from Sheba shall come. They shall bring gold and frankincense, and shall proclaim the praise of the Lord. All the flocks of Kedar shall be gathered to you. The rams of Am shall minister to you. They shall be acceptable on my altar, and I will glorify my glorious host.
All right. How's that sound so far? Pretty good, huh?
Uplifting.
All right. I mean, all these things are going to come your way, right? Keep going.
Hmm?
Yeah.
Who are these that fly like a cloud and like doves to their windows? For the coastlands shall wait for me, and the ships of Tarshish first, to bring your children from far away, their silver and gold with them, for the name of the Lord your God, and for the Holy One of Israel, because he has glorified you. Foreigners shall build up your walls, and their kings shall minister to you. For in my wrath I struck you down, but in my favor I have had mercy on you. Your gates shall always be open, day and night, they shall not be shut, so that nations shall bring you their wealth, with their kings led in procession. For the nation and kingdom that will not serve you shall perish, for those nations shall be utterly laid waste. The glory of Lebanon shall come to you, the cypress, the plane, and the pine, to beautify the place of my sanctuary, and I will glorify where my feet rest. The descendants of those who oppressed you shall come bending low to you, and all who despised you shall bow down at your feet. They shall call you the city of the Lord, the Zion of the Holy One of Israel. Whereas you have been forsaken and hated, with no one passing through, I will make you majestic forever, a joy from age to age. You shall suck the milk of nations. You shall suck the breast of kings. And you shall know that I, the Lord, am your Savior and your Redeemer, the mighty one of Jacob.
So what's going to happen to all those people who beat up on you through the centuries? They're going to finally get theirs, right? Skip ahead to chapter 61 and somebody read verses 1 through 4.
The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me. He has sent me to bring good news to the oppressed, to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives and release to the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn, to provide for those who mourn in Zion, to give them a garland instead of ashes, the oil of gladness instead of mourning, the mantle of praise instead of a faint spirit. They will be called oaks of righteousness, the planting of the Lord to display his glory. They shall build up the ancient ruins. They shall raise up the former devastations. They shall repair the ruined cities, the devastations of many generations.
And go through verse 7.
Strangers shall stand and feed your flocks. Foreigners shall till your land and dress your vines. But you shall be called priests of the Lord. You shall be named ministers of our God. You shall enjoy the wealth of the nations, and in their riches you shall glory. Because their shame was doubled, and dishonor was proclaimed as their lot. Therefore they shall possess a double portion. Everlasting joy shall be theirs.
All right. Sounds pretty good, huh? Turn to Luke chapter 4. Keep your finger, by the way, if you can. For those of you using a machine, you'll tell it to go to Luke 4 and then hit the back arrow to go back to Isaiah. It doesn't work that way. Oh, well, sorry. Luke 4. Starting in verse 16.
Nazareth, where he had been brought up, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor."
All right, stop you there. Go back and look at Isaiah chapter 61. See it? That's what he's reading. So what the section we just read, he's reading a section out of the middle of it. Go back to Luke. Jace, go ahead.
And he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him. Then he began to say to them, "Today, this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing."
Okay, stop you there, right? So he's just read this passage and everybody's looking at him. And they've heard already a little bit about some of the stuff he's been doing in other places. And he's now come back to his hometown and he says, this passage is fulfilled. Keep going.
All spoke well of him and were amazed at the gracious words that came from his mouth. They said, "Is this not Joseph's son?"
All right? So they like this sermon. Keep going.
He said to them, "Doubtless you will quote to me this proverb, 'Doctor, cure yourself.' And you will say, 'Do here also in your hometown the things that we have heard you did at Capernaum.'"
Okay, so we don't like what you're saying, he says, but you're going to say, we want some of this glory, right? Keep going.
And he said, "Truly, I tell you, no prophet is accepted in the prophet's hometown. But the truth is, there were many widows in Israel in the time of Elijah, when the heaven was shut up 3 years and 6 months, and there was a severe famine over all the land. Yet Elijah was sent to none of them, except to a widow at Zarephath in Sidon. There were also many lepers in Israel in the time of the prophet Elisha, and none of them was cleansed except Naaman, the Syrian."
Now, do you recognize Zarephath and Sidon? Probably not. But the Sidonians are not Israelites. Naaman, the Syrians are not Israelites. And you may be aware, there's a little tension between today's version of Israel and today's version of Syria, even right now, right? So what does he say? He says, it doesn't work for prophets in their hometown. And you're going to say, do the stuff here that we heard you do elsewhere? Well, let me tell you the truth. Back in Elijah's time, there were all kinds of widows, and he was sent to a foreigner. There were all kinds of lepers when Elisha did his work, and he cleansed a foreigner. Keep going.
They heard this, all in the synagogue were filled with rage. They got up, drove him out of town, and led him to the brow of the hill on which their town was built, so that they might hurl him off the cliff. But he passed through the midst of them and went on his way.
So as Jesus quotes some of these passages and teaches about what they mean, don't be surprised if he meets some opposition, right? So this struggle, this challenge, this return from Babylon has reformed the people in some ways, but part of the challenge is, how has it reformed them? Which of those various streams are they going to grab a hold of? And that's what we'll be exploring in the next unit. You ready to pray? Lord, make us instruments of your peace. Where there is hatred, let us sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is discord, union. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. O divine Master, grant that we may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, and it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as in heaven. Give us today our daily bread. Forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us. Save us from the time of trial and deliver us from evil. For the kingdom, the power, and the glory are yours, now and forever. Amen. So, I'm going to sort of officially stop here, but if you'd like to stay and because I had asked you to read through Ezekiel and Ezra and Nehemiah, and so I'm going to do a little journey through that really quick. If you want to hang for that, you certainly may. It'll be recorded, so it'll be there for later, but just want to be kind of sensitive to our time here because it's going to take us a bit to get through all of that. So if you want to hang around, there aren't really pictures for it, but that's the narrative that we were kind of following in many ways. And so totally up to you, but I won't feel offended if you get up and walk out. But for those of that you want to turn to Ezra and Nehemiah, and interestingly enough, right in the sort of the middle of our Old Testaments, in chapter 1 of Ezra, we're given the setting and the time, right? It's the first year of King Cyrus of Persia. And he gives an order that Jeremiah had referenced earlier, that he stirred up his spirit, it says, so that he sent a herald throughout his kingdom with this declaration. And if somebody's in Ezra chapter 1, you can read verses 2, 3, and 4.
Thus says King Cyrus of Persia, the Lord, God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth. He has charged me to build him a house in Jerusalem and Judah. Any of those among him who are of his people, may their God be with them, are now permitted to go up to Jerusalem and Judah and rebuild the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. He is the God who is in Israel. And let all survivors in whatever place they reside be assisted by the people in their place with silver and gold, with goods and with animals, besides free will offerings for the house of God in Jerusalem.
Okay, so if you want to look for just a moment at your timelines.
I forget that here.
All right. At the very top, find 1100, the ball with 1100, and go straight to the top. And straight to the top, you see that head, and it says Assyria. And now you see yellow boxes with black letters. You can, I've got several. Okay. All right. So we got yellow boxes with black letters. And interestingly enough, you look at the number 1, and here you go back to the other part of the timeline with all the numbers, and you see the first yellow box with the black letters, and it says Tiglath-Pileser the first. Yes, everybody see that? And then you look at number 2, which lasts about 200 years, and you say, who the heck lived that long? And you look at number 2, and it just says Assyria was weak during that time. So they aren't even giving you any information about the kings, right? But so the Assyrian Empire, what that's trying to show is over those centuries from about 1100 BC to the middle of about 650 or so, the Assyrian Empire was the primary foreign power in the realm. But notice how around above 700, the Babylonians start to emerge, and pretty soon they get to the top of the timeline. See that? And they go for a while. And then they aren't nearly as long. You see, Persia goes up. And look at 539. You'll see a pink dot that says Cyrus. See where it is, about an inch or so from the top, kind of right there? If you find 539 on the red and come straight down, you'll see the pink top. So in 539 BC, Cyrus captures Babylon. And now the Persian Empire is the dominant empire in the realm until a couple centuries later, you'll see that the Greeks and the Macedonians, they're, by the way, out in the west, they will eventually come to power, but we'll get there later. So just to set it on your timeline, this is where the Cyrus the Persian shows up. And this is the Cyrus that's being talked about here in Ezra. So the Babylonians were in control. He overruns Babylon, and he makes this declaration that God had somehow gotten a message to him that he is to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. And so the people are starting to go back. And what you read about in verse 5 of chapter 1 in Ezra, you start reading about the heads of the families, the priests, the Levites. It says everyone whose spirit God had stirred got up, got ready to go, and to rebuild the house. And their neighbors helped them. They got silver, gold, goods, animals, gifts, whatever it was. And then verse 7 says King Cyrus himself went into the treasury and located whatever items, articles King Nebuchadnezzar had taken from Jerusalem, and he handed those on and told the people to go and do this. And then at the end of chapter 1, you get an inventory. And perhaps you noticed, if you got a chance to read Ezra and Nehemiah, they do a lot of counting of items, and they do a lot of genealogical tracking. Because when you come back from Babylon, one of the concerns is, are you legitimate or not? Because the other thing that'll really rear its head in the Ezra Nehemiah narrative and in that post-exilic time in Judah is this total restriction on who you can marry. And any foreign anything is looked on as bad, bad, bad.
They call it ethnic cleansing.
Well, in the strongest sense, they didn't do ethnic cleansing, but what they did was ethnic divorce. And so you'll read about this great struggle. And again, it's a challenge, right? Because all the way through, you have Abraham marrying a relative that later on in Leviticus, that marriage would have been declared invalid because they're too close. You don't marry your father's daughter, or, you know, whatever, that it just that way. Or you have Moses, who's married a Cushite, an Ethiopian. Maybe she was even black, right? So you have some of that tension. But you have David, who's descended from a Moabite woman. Or you have Rahab the harlot, or, you know, so they've got in their history stories of foreign people who have been integrated into their story, but post-exilic, that's all going away. And so there's this sort of really strict, rigorous observance of some of these things. So at the end of chapter 1 in Ezra, you hear about Sheshbazzar. He's one of the rulers who's there. These were all brought up, and the exiles then traveled from Babylonia to Jerusalem. And we're not given a lot of detail about that journey, that 900,000-mile journey. But then you hear again, chapter 2 actually begins to list the people and to list them by groups and clans. in chapter 2, verse 2, you see that interesting name Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel and Jeshua, though Zerubbabel is actually a descendant of David, but he's not a king, he doesn't assume a royal office. Jeshua, we'd also say Joshua, he's one of the priests. And you'll hear these, this many people, and they came from here, and they start listing all these different numbers. And this becomes a little bit difficult reading because most of us aren't interested in these kinds of facts and details. But it will even talk about how they searched the genealogical records, and they couldn't find, that so-and-so for sure were truly of the priestly clan, so they aren't able to participate in the rituals. So there's this great concern with being ethnically pure, with making sure that there's none of this monkey business that we saw happening before, where people were doing roles of priests when they weren't priests, or things like that. But at the end of chapter 2, then you got verse 64 says the whole assembly together was 42,360. I like a nice round number, right? Besides their male and female servants who were, and they name them, and then they even go so far as to count how many donkeys they have. So this is in here. And again, what we don't always know for sure when we look at these numbers, are these including the women? It's very often it's just counting the men, so you kind of have and women and children, but they're doing this. And so in chapter 3, the 7th month, they're in their towns, they gather in Jerusalem. Now you have Jeshua, the son of Jehozadak, with his fellow priest Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, with his king. They're set out to build the altar, right? And they want to offer burnt offerings. This is going to be all as prescribed in the law of Moses, the man of God, right? So catching all of those pieces. And they begin to keep, it says, the festival of booths and the daily burnt offerings. This is in verses 4 and 5 and following. Verse 6 tells us that from the first day of the 7th month, they began to offer burnt offerings, but the foundation of the temple was not yet laid. So they've got the altar going and they're getting the sacrifices going, but the temple itself is not. And so now they get money that gets given, as well as food and oil and drink, and they start collecting trees and all of these things because they want, as it says at the end of verse 7, to fulfill that grant that King Cyrus of Persia had given to them. It picks up then the second year after they got back. So as time goes on, you're hearing how they've got the foundations laid and they're getting things going. In verse 11, they sing, praising that the Lord is good, right? His steadfast love endures forever. And here's where we read. Somebody read verse 11, 12, and 13. Chapter 3. Go ahead.
With praise and thanksgiving, they sang to the Lord. He is good. His love toward Israel endures forever. And all the people gave a great shout of praise to the Lord because the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid. But many of the older priests and Levites and family heads who had seen the former temple wept aloud when they saw the foundation of this temple being laid, while many others shouted for joy. No one could distinguish the sound of the shouts of joy from the sound of weeping because the people made so much noise and the sound was heard far away.
All right, so it's a mix of joy and delight, but also sadness and grief. And now it begins to happen that some of the surrounding peoples are in opposition to this whole project. And so you read about some of that occurring. And even this, interesting, right? Chapter 4 says, when the adversaries of Judah and Benjamin, those are the two tribes that returned, heard that the returned exiles were building a temple to the Lord, they approached Zerubbabel. They said, let us build with you, for we worship your God as you do. We've been sacrificing to him ever since the days of King Esarhaddon of Assyria, who brought us here. Okay, these are Samaritans. They say, can we join with you? Their answer? So do you want to know why? This is 515-ish, 518-ish BC, when Jesus talks to the woman at the well, who's a Samaritan. She says, why are you even talking to me? Your people don't like my people. We don't do anything together. I mean, this is the roots of some of this. I sort of wonder, what if they would have said yes? Right? And you heard me say, like back with the Garden of Eden, right? When God said, Adam, did you eat that tree? He said, yeah, God, I did. I'm really sorry. That's not what he said. And I said, well, that woman, the woman, your gift to me messed up my life, right? I mean, that kind of thing. I wonder what would have happened if they simply would have said, we'd love to have you become a part of this project, but it isn't what happens. And so there we hear how they discouraged them and they bribed officials. They tried to frustrate the plans so that it sort of dies. And while Cyrus is king, it doesn't happen. And we have to wait now for another king, Darius or Darius, depending on how you want to pronounce that. And by the way, the reign of some of yours might say Artaxerxes in chapter 4 verse 6. Others of you will have Ahasuerus, right? Same thing. That's the king who's ruling when the story of Esther is happening. So this now is parallel, at least as the narratives line up with the king, this is the king who's the king when Esther in that whole story is unfolding, right? And you get this letter written against Jerusalem, right? And they go and they dig up and they say, you got to understand, if you let this thing continue, this city is always rebellious. As soon as they get established and set back up, they are no longer going to pay customs. This is not going to be good for your revenue. They will stop paying taxes or whatever. And so they made this decree, and therefore, verse 21, issue an order that these people be made to cease, the city not be rebuilt, right? This is what they want. And so that letter was brought to the king. And so now it stops until Darius is king. And then names you probably recognize in chapter 5, Haggai, Zechariah, and we actually have their writings. And Haggai especially, his whole purpose is encouraging the people to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. But while this is happening and they are encouraging this to go on, we hear about Tattenai, who's the governor in that province, and they're coming and having this debate. So there's this ongoing struggle, and he sends a letter to Darius, and Darius in turn does some digging. And you find out in chapter 6 that they didn't find it in Babylon, but they found it in one of their other store series. They found this record, right? And somebody read chapter 6, verses 1 through 5.
So Emperor Darius issued orders for a search to be made in the royal records that were kept in Babylon. But it was in the city of Ecbatana in the province of Media that a scroll was found containing the following record. In the first year of his reign, Emperor Cyrus commanded that the temple of Jerusalem be rebuilt as a place where sacrifices are made and burnt offerings are burned. The temple is to be 90 feet high, 90 feet wide. The walls are to be built with 1 layer of wood on top of each 3 layers of stone. All expenses are to be paid by the royal treasury. Also, the gold and silver utensils which King Nebuchadnezzar brought to Babylon from the temple in Jerusalem are to be returned to their proper place in the Jerusalem temple.
Okay, so guess what? They found the record, and so the subsequent verses have them, Darius saying, we're going to do this. So in fact, the Tattenai, you're trying to stop this, you're actually now going to give them the money to fund it. And that's what happens. And in this rebuilding, the cost is to be paid. For example, I make a decree regarding what you shall do for these elders of the Jews For the rebuilding of this house of God, the cost is to be paid to this people in full without delay from the royal revenue, the tribute of the province beyond the river. That's what it's called, the tribute of the province beyond the river, from the Babylonian side of things and the Persian side of things. Whatever they need, give them, right? And it's not just, notice, bulls, rams, sheep, but it's even things like wheat, salt, wine, oil, whatever it is, let it be given day to day. And this is interesting. Verse 10, so that they may offer pleasing sacrifices to the God of heaven and pray for the life of the king and his children. So historians will kind of use this language. They will say that a person like Darius or Cyrus before him, they are more enlightened rulers. They recognize if you try to squash the religious practices of the people that you have under your power, all you're going to do is stir up, animosity and foment revolution. But if you let them stay with what they're doing and even encourage them to practice their religious practices and put a good word in for you, that's a good way to go. And I'll tell you, in my years of being a pastor, there've been a number of times where when people find that out, they say, would you put in a good word for me? Glad to help you with this repair, pastor, and put in a good word for me. I mean, it's that same kind of similarity here. And so they do so. In verse 16, it says, the priests, the people, the Levites, the rest of the exiles, they celebrate the dedication. So let's pick up from there and read. Somebody read 13 through 18.
And according to the word sent by King Darius to the governor of the province beyond the river, and their associates did all with diligence that King Darius had ordered. So the elders of the Jews built and prospered through the prophesying of the prophet Haggai and Zechariah, son of Iddo. They finished their building by command of the God of Israel and by decree of Cyrus, Darius, and King Artaxerxes of Persia. And this house was finished on the 3rd day of the month Adar, and the 6th year in the reign of King Darius. The people of Israel, the priests and the Levites, and the rest of the returned exiles celebrated the dedication of the house of God with joy. They offered at the dedication of this house of God 100 bulls, 200 rams, 400 lambs, and the sin offering for all Israel, 12 male goats according to the number of tribes in Israel. Then they set the priests in their divisions and the Levites in their courses for the service of God at Jerusalem, as it is written in the book of Moses.
So that's 515 BC when the temple is rebuilt. And we hear in the remaining verses that they celebrate the Passover, right? So these festivals become central and course for them. And people are so excited. It says, notice verse 21, it was eaten by the people of Israel who returned from exile, also by all who had joined them and separated themselves from the pollutions of the nations of the land to worship the Lord, right? So you're hearing in some of this whole kind of, we are other, we are separate, we are not them kind of thing. But there's great celebration. And chapter 7 talks about Ezra coming at this time. So even though this book has his name, he's apparently not involved up until this point. But Ezra, he's a priest, he's a scribe. He will come and he will be the one who begins really to sort of centralize worship, to make sure everything's done properly. He's the guy who will, we'd say, dots all the I's and crosses all the T's. He becomes the religious authority to make sure whom everything is done properly. And Nehemiah will also serve a similar function. And historically, we don't know exactly, how this all lays out and stuff, but there's multiple things going on. And so what really happens in the rest of the book is both the celebration of the gifts for the temple. You have in chapter 9, the whole issue of mixed marriages. I'll read, after these things had been done, the officials approached me and said, the people of Israel, the priests, the Levites, have not separated themselves from the people of the lands with their abominations, from the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites, the Amobites, the Moabites, the Egyptians, and the Amorites. For they have taken some of their daughters as wives for themselves and for their sons. Thus the holy seed has mixed itself with the peoples of the land. And in this faithlessness, the officials and leaders have led the way. When I heard this, I tore my garment and my mantle. I pulled hair from my head and beard and sat appalled. Then all who trembled at the words of the God of Israel because of the faithlessness of the people returned exiled gathered around me while I sat appalled until the evening sacrifice. So there's this whole, because their involvement with the foreigners led to their adopting the idolatry. On this side, it's like we're going to go the other direction and we will have as little involvement with any foreigners as absolutely possible, and we will terminate whatever mixed marriages may occur. And so you have this tragic story, for example, in chapter 10 of the wives. If they had a foreign wife and had any children with that wives, they were simply driven away. And that wasn't universally accepted. There were some who disagreed with it, but by and large, this is what happened. So there is this kind of, and I won't use the phrase ethnic cleansing because that typically means the obliteration of that, but it is that kind of purging of any ties whatsoever with anybody foreign. And if you look at how the book ends, it's all of these names and all of these genealogy, and they want to make sure they are pure. And that's the end of Ezra. And then Nehemiah, and by the way, Ezra and Nehemiah, if I'm remembering correctly, are one scroll. So they're kind of one right after the other. Nehemiah, meanwhile, is a butler, essentially, we would call him, or if you will, a taste tester. He holds the king's cup, which means anything before the king drinks it, he drinks it. If he survives, he can give it to the king. That's his job, right? And so we're told about him, given a little bit about his heritage. He's in Susa, and while he's there, he gets visited by somebody who had gone back to Judah and now had come back to report on the conditions in the land. And he says in verse 3, the survivors there in the province who escaped captivity are in great trouble and shame. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down. Its gates have been destroyed by fire. And so much of Nehemiah's work will be rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. And so he's so disturbed by this that he lifts up a rather beautiful prayer of how, we have sinned, right? Somebody read verses 4 through 11. Chapter 1.
When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. Then I said, O Lord, God of heaven, the great and awesome God, who keeps his covenant of love with those who love him and obey his commands. Let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer your servant is praying before you day and night for your servants, the people of Israel. I confess the sins we Israelites, including myself and my father's house, have committed against you. We have acted very wickedly toward you. We have not obeyed the commands, decrees, and laws you gave your servant Moses. Remember the instruction you gave your servant Moses, saying, if you are faithful, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. But if you return to me and obey my commands, then even if your exiled people are at the farthest toward the horizon, I will gather them from there and bring them to the place I have chosen as a dwelling for my name. Then your servants and your people, whom you redeemed by your great strength and your mighty hand, O Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of this your servant and to the prayer of your servants who delight in revering your name. Give your servant success today by granting him favor in the presence of this man.
So so distraught is he that he's moved to think, I can do something about it. So there's a wonderful, you may have heard this before. It's kind of this wonderful prayer that we could pray for ourselves that goes something like this: God, let the things that break your heart break my heart. And so as this is happening, we're told he's the cupbearer, he's the butler, and this is now Artaxerxes. So take our Ezra story. This is Artaxerxes. So the order is kind of following along in there. And apparently the next day when he goes to work or whatever, the next time he goes to work and he's bringing in the food, he looks like he's been crying. We've all seen people who've been crying. The king asks him, he says, verse 2, why is your face sad? You're not sick. This is sadness of heart. What's going on? And so he sort of takes a deep breath and tells the king what he found out. And the king he's essentially saying, can I get what would you call it? Sabbatical, temporary leave, a short time release from my job to go and handle these matters. And that ends up what happens. And so Nehemiah now is the one who's going to go back to rebuild the walls. And again, there's some overlap of when Ezra and Nehemiah are there, but it's a little tricky to figure it out exactly. But this is what he does. He comes to Jerusalem now in verse 11 of chapter 2. And he gets up at night. He goes out and inspects the walls. He doesn't really tell anybody what he's planning to do at that point, but he discovers that all these walls are in bad shape. And that's when the decision is made at the end of chapter 2 to go ahead and rebuild the walls. And so that's what they begin to do. And you'll hear about how different groups of people work on different sections of the wall. That begins in chapter 3. And you hear these little breaks, right? So the high priest, he works on the sheep gate. Then the sons of Hassaniah, they do on the fish gate. And then next to them, and you're just kind of getting this description all the way around the walls of who's doing what. And by the time you get to chapter 4, same sort of thing happens, different names. You've got people who are upset about that. And you've got Sanballat. He's angry. Verse 1. You've got Tobiah the Ammonite. He's mentioned in verse 3. Later on, you'll hear about the Arabs. They're not excited about what's happening in Jerusalem. Not right. I mean, you kind of go, okay, I see some of that, but this is all. And so in verse 8, they're plotting together to come and fight and put a stop to this. And in the meanwhile, then they're learning of this. And so they decide from now on, half the people are going to work while half the people are on guard duty. And everybody's going to have their, I think about the carpenter belt, right, that they wear. I don't know if they had something like that, but essentially they got their tools at one place and their weapons in another. And they're constantly working to make sure that they can get this taken care of. You also end up having these threats that are made against Nehemiah. And they say, hey, why don't you come down here? We want to meet with you and have a private meeting to discuss this. And he figures, no, you're not trying to discuss this. You're simply trying to lure me away so you can kill me, right? You want to take out the leaders. Look at chapter 6. Somebody read verses 1 through 9.
Now, when it was reported to Sanballat and Tobiah and to Geshem, the Arabs, to the rest of our enemies that I had built the wall and that there was no gap left in it, though at time I had not set up the doors or the gates, Sanballat and Geshem came to me saying, come and let us meet together in one of the villages on the plain of Onan. But they intended to do me harm, so I sent messengers to them saying, I am doing a great work and I can't come down. Why should the work stop while I leave it to come down to you? They sent to me 4 times in this way, and I answered them in the same manner. In the same way, Sanballat for the 5th time sent his servant to me with an open letter in his hand. And it was written, it is reported among the nations that Geshem also says it, that you and the Jews intend to rebel. That is why you are building up the wall. And according to this report, you wish to become their king. You have also set up prophets proclaim in Jerusalem concerning you. There is a king in Judah. And now it will be reported to the king according to those words. So come, therefore, let us confer together. Then I sent to them, saying, no such things as you say have been done. You are inventing them out of your own mind. For they all wanted to frighten us, thinking their hands will drop from the work, and it will not be done. But now will God strengthen my hands.
Okay, so this is all these different things, and then the next paragraph talks about how somebody wanted to kind of call him to a secret meeting in the temple, and you got to hide because they're trying to kill you. You better run away. All these sorts of things. So all these efforts to try and stop, they don't work. And so finally, the wall is completed. And it says, verse 15 of chapter 6, so the wall was finished on the 25th day of the month of Elul in 52 days. And when all our enemies heard of it, all the nations around us were afraid and fell greatly in their own esteem. For they perceived that this work had been accomplished with the help of our God. Moreover, in those days, the nobles of Judah sent many letters to Tobiah, and Tobiah's letters came to them. For many in Judah were bound by oath to him, because he was the son-in-law of Shechaniah, son of Ara, and his son Jehohanan had married the daughter of Meshullam, son of Berechiah. And they also spoke of his good deeds in my presence, and reported my words to him, and Tobiah sent letters to intimidate me. So notice these alliances and these connections and these kind of competing voices and forces. But once this happens, there is great celebration. And they begin now to move people out of the country into the city to try and populate it. And now you start to get a list of all of these people and making sure that they have the right sort of ancestry and heraldry so that they are able to do this. Okay? That takes us through chapter 7. And now Nehemiah tells us about Ezra. So here's a little bit of crossover. And Ezra calls forth the people to follow. And so look at verse 9 of chapter 8. You've got Nehemiah, who's the governor at this point, and Ezra, who's the priest and the scribe. So it's really under their leadership that all of this centralization comes in place. And they celebrate, here's a festival in chapter 8, verse 13 and following, the Feast of Booths, which commemorates their time in the wilderness. And we'll hear about the Feast of Booths in the New Testament as well. But notice the language, for example, somebody read verse 17 through the end of chapter 8.
And all the assembly of those who had returned from the captivity made booths and lived in them. For from the days of Jeshua son of Nun to that day, the people of Israel had not done so. And there was very great rejoicing. And day by day, from the first day to the last day, he read from the book of the law of God. They kept the festival 7 days, and on the 8th day, there was a solemn assembly according to the ordinance.
So notice, right? They basically say, you go all the way back in our history when we started in this land. Nobody has done it like us, right? It's kind of a rededication, but sort of almost a hyper vigilance to try and make sure that absolutely nothing is being done. They want all the I's dotted and all the T's crossed. Then chapter 9, we'll talk about kind of a restoring and a rereading of their history. And they're listening for this. And how about this, folks? I'm going to read this one. Look at chapter 9, verse 3. They stood up in their place and read from the book of the law of the Lord their God for a fourth part of the day. And for another fourth part, they made confession and worshiped the Lord their God. So don't complain to me about a 75-minute service. Isn't that great? I mean, but you get this sort of heightened sense. And look at this prayer. Somebody read verses 6 through 8.
Answer said, "You are the Lord, you alone. You have made heaven, the heaven of heavens, with all their hosts, the earth and all that is on it, the seas and all that is in them. To all of them you give life, and the host of heaven worships you. You are the Lord, the God who chose Abram and brought him out of Ur of the Chaldeans and gave him the name Abraham. And you found his heart faithful before you and made with him a covenant to give to his descendants the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites, and the Girgasites. And you have fulfilled your promise, for you are righteous."
What is that? Which part? It's the historical prologue. Hear it? And look what comes next. You saw the distress in Egypt, right? You took us through Egypt, right? It's so what's happening? This is a covenant renewal. But look at verse 16. But they and our ancestors acted presumptuously and stiffened their necks, and they did not obey your commandments. They refused to obey. They were not mindful of the wonders you performed, right? And that kind of goes on and on and on. So not only what God has done in his goodness, but how the people rebelled. And by the way, this rebellion that's being talked about here is in the wilderness. It's all a part of that. Nevertheless, verse 26 says, they were obedient and rebelled against you and cast your law behind their backs and killed your prophets who warned them in order to turn back to you. 27. Therefore you gave them into the hands of their enemies who made them suffer, right? They cried out to you. Verse 29, you warned them in order to turn them back. And yet, verse 31, nevertheless, in your great mercies, you did not make an end of them or forsake them. Now, therefore, our God, the great and awesome God, keeping covenant and steadfast love, do not treat lightly all the hardship that has come upon us, upon our kings, our officials, our priests, our prophets, our ancestors, and your people since the time of the kings of Assyria until today. So notice how they are remembering, right? They're not just talking about the past, but it's us. It's our, right? All of this is taking place. Verse 33, you've been just in all that has come upon us. You've dealt faithfully, right? Our kings, our officials, our priests, they've not kept or heeded your commandments, right? And verse 36, here we are, slaves to this day, slaves in the land that you gave to our ancestors. Its rich yield goes to kings whom you have set over us because of our sins. They have power also over our bodies, over our livestock at their pleasure. We are in great distress. But because of all this, we make a firm agreement. See, so they are recommitting themselves to the covenant. And now you got to list the names of all the people who are doing that. And the obligations, right? So in a way, they are naming the stipulations that they plan to follow and keep. Look at verse 32, for example. Chapter 10 now. It says, we also lay on ourselves the obligations to charge ourselves yearly 1/3 of a shekel for the service of the house of our God. That will become known as the temple tax. And someone will approach Peter and say, does your master pay the temple tax? And he says, sure he does. And he goes back to Jesus, and Jesus says, oh, you had a little conversation, Peter? He says, tell you what, take a line, a hook, go fishing. The first fish you catch, you'll open its mouth. There'll be a shekel in its mouth. Why don't you take that shekel and pay it? Half will be your temple tax. The other half will be mine. Kind of fun. But they have all these things. They dedicate the city wall in chapter 10. They talk about all the responsibilities. And then in the final chapter of Nehemiah, we read again about separating the foreigners from Israel. And there are Sabbath, no, making darn sure we don't do any business on the Sabbath. And let's read that last little section. Somebody pick up chapter 13, starting at verse 15.
In those days I saw men in Judah treading wine presses on the Sabbath and bringing in grain and loading it on donkeys, together with wine, grapes, figs, and all other kinds of loads. And they were bringing all this into Jerusalem on the Sabbath. Therefore I warned them against selling food on that day. Men from Tyre who lived in Jerusalem were bringing in fish and all kinds of merchandise and selling them in Jerusalem on the Sabbath to the people of Judah. I rebuked the nobles of Judah and said to them, what is this wicked thing you are doing, desecrating the Sabbath day? Didn't your forefathers do the same things so that our God brought all this calamity upon us and upon this city? And you are stirring up more wrath against Israel by desecrating the Sabbath.
So here already are these early emergences of don't screw up the Sabbath. And of course, you can imagine this is in 515-ish, early 500s, wherever 500 years later, they've only intensified. And so when Jesus does things on the Sabbath, this is part of the reason the religious leaders get so angry at him. Okay. Finally, it warns them about it began to be dark, says verse 19, close the doors, bar them, and people were trying to do business. It's not going to happen. And the last sort of things is these mixed marriages are condemned. And Nehemiah ends with these words. Thus I cleanse them from everything foreign, and I established the duties of the priests, the Levites, each in his work, and I provided for the wood offering at appointed times and for the first fruits. Remember me, O my God, for good. And given the time, I'm not going to go into Jeremiah or Ezekiel, but what I'll tell you is this. Ezekiel is a priest who's carried off into exile in the first wave of exiles. So while Jeremiah is doing his work back in Jerusalem, warning the people to turn and repent, and the people aren't listening, Ezekiel is with the exiles in Babylon, trying to counteract the false prophets in Babylon who were saying it's only going to be a couple of years and the people are going to come back. And Ezekiel does a whole bunch of different things. But if you can, read chapter 37, which is the Valley of Dry Bones, because 37 is a wonderful chapter because it gives you a sense of how the Israelites, the people in exile, thought it's over, it's done. But God said, it's not over and done. So we'll end with that. Thank you. A little extra time.
What I thought was interesting